Hello and welcome to Why Fair-Minded People Should Support Israel, featuring Shale Horowitz. My name is Michael Mantell. Thank you to those who are here with us today and those viewing this recording. A loving shout out to my amazing parents and a very special thank you to all of our guest speakers and presenters, especially today's guest, Shale Horowitz. Today's program is presented in partnership with 7 incredible groups and organizations, including the Rededication Project, CUNY Alliance for Inclusion, also known as CAFI, Alums for Campus Fairness, Students Supporting Israel, VUJU Amsterdam, StandWithUs, and the May Ever Youth Movement of Moise Safra Center and Prat Leadership Academies in Israel. It is now my honor to introduce our featured guest. Shale Horowitz is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research has examined international and ethnic conflict, the politics of international trade and finance, and the politics of institutional change. He is the author or co-author of over 50 journal articles and the author or co-editor of 5 books. His current research interests include ethno-territorial wars, Chinese foreign policy, and Indo-Pacific security. Throughout Shale's presentation, we invite you to write your comments or questions in the chat. At the end of the presentation, we will open the program for Q&A. No matter how incredible these programs are, and thank God they always are, your participation at the end of the program adds so much more meaning and value. At that time, please feel free to raise your virtual hand for me to call on you, or unmute yourself to ask your questions directly, or I can share your questions and comments that you have written in the chat at that later time in the program. And just a few announcements before we begin. We have 3 very wonderful programs coming up this week and next week that I hope you will save the date and join us for. In 2 days, on Wednesday, December 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time via Zoom, please join me and 3GNY for a conversation with author and 3G, the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, Brooke Randall, to celebrate the release of her new memoir titled Also Here, Love, Literacy, and the Legacy of the Holocaust. On Sunday, December 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time via Zoom, please join me for a very unique Sundays with Survivors featuring Ted Comet, the spouse of Holocaust survivor Shoshana Comet of blessed memory. In that program, Ted Comet will share Shoshana's Holocaust testimony through a visual tour of 5 larger-than-life tapestries created in the late 1960s by Ted's wife, Shoshana. These tapestries were recently on loan for exhibit at the Center for Jewish History in New York City. Through the lens of these unique works of art and Shoshana's story, Ted explores the themes of Holocaust history, trauma, psychological repair, and an affirmation of life. And on Monday, December 16th, at 1:30 p.m. via Zoom, please join me for a very special program featuring Charlotte Korchak, the international senior educator at StandWithUs, who will be speaking about the dueling narratives of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The presentation will show the major differences in how each side views and relates to the history and current events, and will highlight the divide that needs to be bridged to achieve a lasting peace. The programs featuring Ted Comet and Charlotte Korchak are in partnership with the Rededication Project, CUNY Alliance for Inclusion, also known as CAFI, Alums for Campus Fairness, Students Supporting Israel, VUJU Amsterdam, StandWithUs, 3GNY, Herut North America, and May Ever Youth Movement of Moise Safra Center and Prat Leadership Academies in Israel. As you can see, there's a lot of exciting program coming up. I hope you can join me and these wonderful partner organization and groups for 1, 2, or all 3 of them. With that, I'd like to once again thank you all for being here today and your continued support of these programs. And again, thank and welcome Shale Horowitz. Shale, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you all for coming and listening tonight. So the approach of our discussion tonight, the main title, Why Fair-Minded People Should Support Israel. So what that means is defending Israel against the attacks that are made on Israel. But my approach here, what I think is most important, is that that must be connected with a comparison of Israel with her enemies. So not only is Israel not guilty of these horrible things, which she is accused of doing, but her enemies are much worse than her. So let me talk a little bit more about that. So the technique of Israel's enemies is to isolate imperfections of Israel and to exaggerate them into cosmic or demonic evils and discuss them in isolation. So in order to refute that type of attack, a few things are necessary. First, these demonic exaggerations are false. That has to be stated and documented. But next, Israel has to be compared with her enemies and other states in the world, in particular her enemies. So Israel is not only guilty of these demonic or extreme crimes, but Israel is far better than her enemies. And finally, Israel's enemies are a danger to everyone else in the world, not just Israel. So let's start with the accusations, the types of accusations that are made against Israel. Okay, in the picture there, you can see that Israel is portrayed as a demon, an absolute evil. And examples of this include calling Israel Nazi, a racist state, apartheid state, settler colonialist state. Israel commits genocide. You can practically feel the spittle hitting you in the face from the hatred. No other state is demonized in this way or treated in this way in the world. So what do these kinds of accusations mean? They mean that Israel has no right to exist in practice. Israel has no right to defend itself because it's so evil. And Israel's enemies have a right to destroy her and to kill or expel her Jewish populations. But whether or not this is reasonable has to be based on comparing Israel with her enemies and other states, especially Israel's enemies. So, does Israel have lesser rights to exist and lesser rights to defend herself than do her enemies or other states? And how does Israel compare to her enemies, both in general, if we look at the patterns over time, and then we'll look in detail at the most recent war, of course, in the last 2 years or so, a year and some months with Hamas. Okay, so let's start out with the claim of Nazi-like imperialism. So let's think about the goals that we associate with evil imperialists. So, of course, the Nazis sought to conquer the world and to enslave or kill peoples that were slated to be subordinate in this future world dominated by them. By contrast, Jewish nationalism has had limited goals, limited territorial goals, fundamentally. Jewish nationalists and Israel, once it came into existence, have always sought to coexist with their Arab Muslim neighbors, to compromise with them. And this has been a continuous effort from before the state came into existence to the present day. This moderation in goals has never changed. If we look at Israel's main enemies, both nearby, either Islamic extremists in the Middle East and in the Muslim world, or pan-Arab socialists, secular version of Islamic extremists in the Arab world, or the far enemy, the communist movement in the rest of the world, which have collaborated with Israel's near enemies. All of these movements and groups of countries have sought global or regional empires. They have sought to impose their own values and institutions on everyone they rule and everyone they conquer and rule over as they expand their control. And any group, including any ethnic religious group or any other type of group which does not accept their ideology, is slated at best for forced assimilation. That is, through state repression, destruction, a slow destruction of its values and institutions at best, or of course at worst, outright killing or forced expulsions. So which of these sides is more imperialist in their goals? Okay, now let's move to methods, the methods that they use. So which side in the methods that they use most resembles Nazis or other extreme imperialists? If we look at Israel in its wars and lower intensity conflicts in between wars, it has always attempted to minimize civilian casualties and suffering in a way which is comparable to the best of all countries involved in similar conflicts, even though it has always faced far greater threats than other countries, even the best of them, such as the United States. On the other hand, Israel's enemies have often intentionally targeted Jewish and other civilian populations for killing. Almost always when they fight wars, they make no effort at all to limit civilian casualties or suffering. And they are among the worst actors in comparable conflicts around the world. And apart from all of the wars against Israel, you can also see this behavior in major civil wars across the Arab world, from Syria to Libya, Algeria, Yemen, Sudan, to take some prominent examples, and in internal wars between states and ethnic minorities seeking self-determination. And to take some examples from among Israel's enemies, those fought by Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Sudan, and Pakistan. And Israel's far enemies, the global far left, led by the Soviet Union while it existed, and China. More recently, Russia fights wars in the same way, also has used such methods against civilians on a massive scale. So again, which side in its methods more closely resembles Nazis or other evil imperialists? Okay, here's another standard accusation made against Israel. Israel is a settler colonialist state. Okay, so to begin with this concept, all peoples other than, small groups of peoples that live on the periphery of civilization, any significant people which has survived to the present has at various times in the past had to fight wars against enemies in order to maintain control of its homeland and survive. And in various ways, all peoples have done that. So the idea that you have conquered a homeland at some point in the past is universal, basically. So it doesn't distinguish one people from another. Now, if we go to specific examples, of course, Jews were the predominant people on the land of Israel for about 2,000 years before the rise of Islam in Arabia. Islam's founder, Muhammad, and his successors conquered the entire Middle East and North Africa and large parts of Europe, Central Asia, and India. So if you look at the maps there on the right, you can see the historical Israelite state at its largest extent under Kings David and Solomon, and you can compare that to the green there on the world map, which is the Umayyad Caliphate. That's the large Islamic empire that came into existence over a few generations after the death of Muhammad. So which side conquered larger areas? The area that is the historical land of Israel includes what the Romans called Palestine after they put down the Jewish revolts about 2,000 years ago, and at the time expelled much of the Jewish population. So that historical area of the land of Israel was renamed Palestine by the Romans, and it was conquered by the early Islamic empires. At the time of the Islamic conquest, the Jewish population was still the largest population in the historic land of Israel, even though there was by then also a large Christian population. That Jewish population under Muslim rule was whittled down over the centuries to a very small population as a result of imperial wars and constant religious discrimination over those many centuries. So if we take the Muslim Arabs, it's hard to think of a conquering people that were more successful settler colonialists in all of world history in the sense of area they conquered and the extent to which they were able to impose their language and culture and religion on that huge area which they conquered. The only example in world history which is comparable to that in its success is the Spanish Empire in the Americas and to a lesser extent in other parts of the world. By contrast, Israel has only been in the past and currently only seeks a small state in its historic homeland, where Jews again preceded Arab Muslims by about 2,000 years. What do Israel's enemies want? They do not just want a 22nd Arab state of Palestine, but in the process, they want to destroy Israel. They want to deny Jews any right to self-determination in their historic homeland. So which of these is more reminiscent of settler colonialism or is a more extreme example of settler colonialism? Is it one of the greatest conquering peoples in world history, which refuses to coexist with a Jewish state? Or is it Jews that seek a tiny state alongside 21 now, and they would accept a 22nd Palestinian Arab state also in order to live in peace? More on settler colonialism. Of course, among Israel's enemies, the Islamic extremists are openly and proudly imperialistic. They seek to reconstitute these historic empires and spread them across the entire world, imposing their preferred version of Islamic law. Israel's far left enemies claim to be opposed to imperialism, but of course they are imperialists themselves, right? Under especially Soviet leadership, they were able to impose control over large parts of the world. And again, they wanted to impose their system exclusively over all of those that they ruled and not to accept any other way of life. So if we think about this charge against Israel of settler colonialism, that Israel has no right to exist, how is it reasonable for far leftists to claim that Arab Muslims have a right to a 22nd state, that would be a Palestinian Arab state, while Jews have no right to any other state? And it's interesting to give a comparison from another part of the world. So suppose there were, some pre-Columbian people in Latin America, in a place like Bolivia or Peru or North America, and a Native American people, which managed to preserve its identity over all of these centuries, and it managed to regain a small historical homeland in a part of Spanish America, which was once ruled by the Spanish Empire. Would it be reasonable for the left to attack that small state of a pre-Columbian people as imperialist and support its reconquest by this world historical conqueror, some kind of Spanish Catholic imperial force seeking its destruction? Well, it certainly wouldn't be reasonable, but of course the far left would be happy to do that if it advanced their political and ideological goals, as ridiculous as that is. Okay, let's talk about another charge now, that Israel is a racist state or that it systematically discriminates. So this takes different forms. The first point there, of course, is that the very idea of calling Jews racist is ridiculous, because Jews are multiracial, of course, and multi-ethnic, as much as Arabs are, even though Arabs are distributed over such a large area. So Jews go from white to black and everything in between, just like Arabs do. Israel's enemies have a habit of accusing Jews of being outsiders in Israel because historically they have intermarried with Europeans and others during periods where they lived in the diaspora. But of course, other peoples in the region, including successful imperial peoples like the Arabs, Persians, and Turks, obviously they have intermarried extensively, including over the peoples with the peoples that they have conquered. And they're never accused of being outsiders in regions that they have historically conquered. So there's another double standard for you. Of all the national movements in the world, only Zionism is branded as inherently racist by the United Nations organizations and by other organizations controlled by its enemies. Of course, national self-determination is a basic principle of international law, which is stated in the UN Charter. Somehow it's only unacceptable when Jews want it. It's only racist and exclusivist when Jews want self-determination. But any other people that is politically approved by Israel's enemies gets this right. More on racism and discrimination. Muslim Arab empires practiced formal legal discrimination against non-Muslims for centuries in regions or areas of the world governed by Islamists, either states or rebel groups around the world. This kind of formal legal discrimination continues to go on. Jews that were resident in Arab countries after 1948, when Israel gained its independence, were driven out of Arab countries, despite the fact that they posed no threat whatsoever to those governments. There was never any self-determination effort or any other effort to be disloyal to the government by Jewish communities in these other Arab countries. By contrast, Israel grants equal rights to its non-Jewish citizens, who together compose over 20% of Israel's population. And Israel has repeatedly, as we mentioned before, accepted the principle of Muslim Arab self-determination, including Palestinian Arab self-determination, in all or almost all of the West Bank and Gaza. And again, this goes back to before Israel came into existence and continues up through the present day. So to summarize about Israel's enemies, they are the foremost imperial movements in the world today, and they have been for much of the last century or so. They are intolerant toward worldviews and lifestyles that deviate from their own approved versions. In other words, they don't believe in coexistence. When they have gained power, they again have systematically discriminated against other groups in an attempt to at least forcibly assimilate them, where they have even tolerated their existence. They don't believe in principles of national self-determination and non-discrimination, except insofar as it serves their own goals, and they deny these rights where it suits them to their enemies and to other countries. And they have made Jews and Israel, the Jewish state, their primary global scapegoat, alongside the greater enemy, or what they sometimes call the Great Satan, the traditional West, and above all, the United States. So now I want to talk a little bit more about how these double standards and comparisons look when it comes to the most recent war with Hamas, which started a little bit over a year ago, October 7th, 2023. So decades of scapegoating have produced this intense hatred of Jews, Zionists, and Israel. Now, this hatred is associated with a narrative or a way of characterizing Israel and Jews, which has a consistent character over time. It has a demonizing character, and it recurs in the same form, always, regardless of how overwhelming the contrary evidence is. So in other words, the hatred exists first, and then regardless of what the facts are in this or any other case, the same hate narrative is generated and is used to attack Israel. So this includes assuming that Israel has no right to exist and no right to defend itself, and therefore Israel must be responsible for whatever its enemies want to do, whatever their goals are, and whatever methods they use. That's understandable given how evil Israel is. And Israel's efforts to defend itself are not just excessive, but are genocidal, are demonic, are the worst possible. And the main method or tactic which they use is to criticize Israel for shortcomings relative to a standard of perfection or near perfection that no country meets in the world, and then to brand Israel as absolutely evil for falling short of this standard of perfection or near perfection. And Israel's near enemies, her immediate enemies in the Middle East and the larger region around it, are typically supported by the far enemy, the far left, in the ideological war, the larger ideological war around the world. So let's discuss a little bit of background first about the Hamas war and what the background of this war is. So how did Hamas, which is a local branch of the global Muslim Brotherhood Islamic extremist movement, the most important and influential Islamic extremist movement in the world, how did Hamas come to power in Gaza in 2007? Well, after quite a long time, after 1967, of ruling over Gaza and the West Bank, Israeli governments, backed by their populations, did not want to rule anymore over these large Palestinian Arab populations. So they attempted to negotiate peace agreements. When those peace agreements were not accepted, when those peace efforts were not accepted, and they still did not want to rule over them directly, they chose the policy that was often called disengagement. That is, they unilaterally pulled out of large regions, especially all of Gaza. And again, this occurred after the PLO refused to accept a state, a Palestinian state in Gaza and in over 90% of the West Bank, including a capital in part of Jerusalem, and further territory from other parts of Israel that would compensate it for the parts of the West Bank that it did not gain in this peace agreement. So this was rejected by the PLO, which instead went to war with Israel and was joined by Hamas after the failure of those peace efforts in the year 2000. So after Israel's withdrawal from Gaza, Hamas won elections, which were held in the West Bank and Gaza, and then seized control from the PLO over Gaza. It imposed an Islamic extremist dictatorship, including Islamic law, over Gaza, and it intensified its conflict, its effort to destroy Israel. Now, why was Hamas able to build up such significant power over time in Gaza, such that the war that broke out in 2023 was such a long, difficult war? Now, there were four major attacks launched by Hamas against Israel previously, starting in 2008, and the most recent example was in 2021. So given the nature of Hamas and its growing power, how could Israel possibly have allowed this threat to take root and to grow to such an ominous scale over time? What is the explanation of this? So again, Israel did not want to rule Gaza directly anymore. So that meant that Israel withdrew from Gaza and did not go back in and try to rule Gaza directly in the way that it had before it withdrew. Once Hamas was in power in Gaza, Israel did not want to go back in and fight a large-scale war with all the casualties and destruction that would result in order to uproot Hamas. So instead, Israel tried to contain the danger of Hamas. So Israel imposed an imperfect, as we know, blockade of military and military-related products in order to limit the buildup of Hamas military power, while still allowing trade and a huge and continuous aid program which raised the standard of living of the Palestinian population in Gaza and in the West Bank, of course, also, but in Gaza to relatively high levels compared to developing countries around the world. But of course, this aid massively empowered Hamas. So of course, the blockade of military and military-related items was ineffective. Large quantities of arms and ammunition and other material to manufacture arms and ammunition and build these massive fortifications above ground and underground in Gaza were brought into Gaza by Hamas. And furthermore, by facilitating this aid, Israel created a situation where Hamas did not have to use its own resources to support its population, number one. And number two, Hamas was actually able to skim large amounts of this aid, which were meant for the population, to supply its own forces. So Israel was actually subsidizing Hamas on a huge scale in order to avoid suffering and in order to avoid having to fight Hamas. And Israel did this because it believed that it could contain Hamas and that the costs of this approach could be kept at a tolerable level, as they were until relatively recently. So what happened on October 7, 2023? You're all aware of this, of course. Hamas overran a large number of Israeli border communities and towns near the Gaza Strip, killing about 1,000 civilians and about 200 soldiers and kidnapping over 200 and bringing them back into Gaza. They gleefully broadcast the massacre, including rape, torture, mutilations, the most horrific stuff that we don't need to imagine because we all saw it. So Israel's response to this horrific attack, people use the phrase horrific all the time, but this kind of gleeful massacre of civilians, which was only limited by their military limitations. They would have killed as many as they could in this way throughout Israel if they had been able to. Israel responded to this by invading Gaza, now deciding that it had to remove Hamas from power. So would any other country with the military capability not to allow Hamas to do this, would they have allowed Hamas to build up power like this on its border? And after October 7th, an October 7th style attack, would they have allowed Hamas to remain in power? Would the US do that? And would Israel's enemies do something like that? We know what the answer to those questions are. What the answers to those questions are. So what were Israel's goals in response to Hamas's attack? First of all, to remove Hamas from power in Gaza, to destroy its military capabilities, and to try to create a situation more similar to what exists in the West Bank. That is, to maintain an Israeli military presence, which would be able to maintain Israel's security while leaving the Palestinian population under some kind of local rule that would not be dangerous to Israel. That was the ideal goal. What methods were used? Israel attempted to minimize civilian killings and suffering. Its efforts are similar to or better than those of the United States or other moderate states that have engaged in similar conflicts, despite far more difficult conditions. And these conditions included 30 to 40,000 Hamas fighters, which intentionally embedded themselves around the civilian population, under the civilian population, making it impossible to fight them without civilians often being in the way. So Israel did its best to minimize civilian casualties under those circumstances, while Hamas did its best to maximize civilian casualties under those conditions. So the response of Israel's enemies was to recreate this standard hate fantasy, that Israel's response was genocidal, it was intentionally killing and starving civilians. And the evidence for this hate fantasy was just that civilian deaths did occur in significant numbers, or civilian suffering did occur in significant amounts. And of course, that's true, and that has been true in all wars of this type. So the evidence for Israel being an absolute evil is that suffering occurred, which was similar to the most limited suffering which had occurred in similar wars at other times and places in the world. So, in other words, Israel, for performing the best or among the best in protecting civilians, is accused of being the worst. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. So, as most of you know, the Hamas casualty numbers are almost certainly exaggerated, both in terms of the total numbers that have died and the total numbers of civilians. And one type of approach, which you commonly see from Israel's enemies, or even in the more mainstream media, is simply to compare total deaths. So Israel's enemies have a lot more deaths than Israel, the implication being, therefore, Israel is wrong or even evil. And of course, this standard is never applied to any other country. Would anybody imagine saying, well, there were far more German or Japanese deaths in World War II than there were British or American deaths, and therefore the Germans and Japanese were in the right and the Americans and British were in the wrong? Of course, no one reasons in that way except when it comes to Israel. Now, if we look at a more reasonable measure, which is often used to measure efforts to limit civilian casualties, this is the ratio of combatants to civilians. So the ratio in this conflict is about 1-to-1, between 1-to-1 and 1-to-5. So in other words, the rough estimates are one combatant killed, one Hamas or other extremist group combatant killed for every one civilian killed, or one combatant killed for every 1.5 civilians killed. This seems to be an accurate estimate. So this is better than what is estimated in comparable battles of the US in Iraq and Afghanistan. In other words, Israel has done better than the US did in similar urban conflicts. And this is despite the fact that the battlefield conditions were much more difficult for Israel, given the almost completely urban battlefield and the effort by Hamas to embed itself among civilians. If we look at other states, especially Israel's enemies, they have far worse records of protecting civilians, and a common estimate for casualties in this type of warfare is 1-to-9, not 1-to-1 or 1-to-1.5. So again, Israel's efforts to minimize civilian casualties are similar to or better than that of the most law-abiding states, including the United States. So here's a quote from John Spencer, who's the foremost expert on on urban warfare in the US military. He says, Israel has implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history, above and beyond what international law requires, and more than the United States did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Examples of what Israel did, I think you're all aware of these: elaborate efforts to inform civilians in advance by all kinds of means before combat occurs, pausing military operations in order to allow civilians to flee, alerting people in advance where fighting would occur, where attacks would occur. And the result of this, of course, were that they created significant military disadvantages for Israel, because Hamas was able to evacuate its leadership and its fighters and many of Israel's hostages in advance of Israeli attacks, making those attacks much less effective. Another example of what Israel did was waiting to attack areas until almost all civilians had left. So, given the efforts made by Israel to minimize civilian casualties, given that Hamas could easily have designated areas for civilians to flee to that it would not defend, it is Hamas that is to blame for almost all the civilian casualties in this war. Now, when it comes to humanitarian assistance for Palestinian Arabs in Gaza, Israel makes elaborate efforts to make it possible for this humanitarian aid to be delivered, like food and medicine. It continuously revises how it does this in response to emerging problems and also, of course, constant pressure from the United States to do better. The problems that were not corrected are mainly due to the fact that Hamas continues to shelter behind civilians. Hamas steals a large proportion of the aid and then resells it on the black market and uses the money to finance its control and its military operations. And it also targets Israeli forces that are facilitating distribution of the aid. So again, the attack is that Israel falls short of a standard of near perfection that is met by no other country, and this falling short of a standard of near perfection is blamed on Israel and not on Hamas. And the hate fantasy is even more extreme, that Israel is doing this intentionally. So overall, the scapegoating of Israel. So the hate fantasy replaces the reality. Israel is an intolerant, merciless imperial entity, which is obviously what Israel's enemies are, not what Israel is. And Israel's defense efforts are defamed as being genocidal, again, because they don't meet standards of near perfection that no other country meets, certainly not Israel's enemies. And even though Israel's efforts are among the best of all countries involved in similar conflicts, they're still routinely branded as genocidal by Israel's enemies. So to conclude with the final few points, what do we do? How do we rebut this attack? So as we've been stressing, there are two important elements here, not only to refute the attacks on Israel, but to immediately counterattack by comparing Israel to its enemies, by showing that Israel's enemies are much worse. And we're going to go through some examples of that when it comes to Israel's right to exist and to self-defense. Another important means of fighting back is to label the enemy evils for what they are, to label these attacks as anti-Semitic, as supportive of genocide against Israel's Jews, and as supportive of these radical ideologies which threaten not only Israel and its Jews, but threaten the whole rest of the world. So let's talk briefly about the right to exist. So here Israel has the same right to exist as do 21, or if we include the Palestinians, 22 other Arab Muslim peoples, or Iran, or Turkey, or any other state in the world for that matter. It's Israel which is accused of imperialism and intolerance when its enemies lead the most powerful imperialist movements in the world. So examples of this is, why is it that only Israel has no right to exist? Why do these other peoples have a right to exist? These other peoples, states, have a right to exist, but the Jewish state doesn't have a right to exist. And in particular, why does Israel have a lesser right to exist than the Arab Muslim states that are descended from the imperial conquerors of the entire region, that came after more than 2,000 years of Jewish predominance in Israel? Israel always has sought peace and coexistence and has repeatedly been willing to accept a Palestinian state in various forms, while Israel's enemies seek her annihilation. Why, under these circumstances, do we blame Israel for this conflict? Why is it right to blame Israel? Now, when it comes to self-defense, again, Israel is among the best of all countries in minimizing harm to civilians in its self-defense efforts. Which countries do more than Israel to protect civilians in war? Do any of Israel's enemies do anywhere near as much as Israel? Why do Israel's enemies only seem to care about civilian suffering in war, or mainly seem to care about civilian suffering in war only when it's in wars involving Israel? Because they hate Israel, and not because primarily of any civilian casualties. Israel's enemies are among the worst, while Israel is among the best, both toward their own people and to outside peoples. In the current war, why is Israel to blame and not Hamas and Israel's other enemies? Why do so many of these groups that support Israel's enemies, why do they vilify Israel while saying little or nothing about the various states governed by Islamic extremist or far leftist regimes or other victimizing states around the world, such as Russia or China? Why support Israel's enemies who threaten the rest of the world also? Okay, just a final few words here about anti-Semitism. So most of you are probably aware of the International Holocaust Remembrance definition of anti-Semitism. This is an international organization of mostly democracies, over 30 democracies, including the United States. And its definition of anti-Semitism includes these two elements at the top, which involve Israel: denying Jews a right of self-determination when this is extended to other peoples, and applying double standards, requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic country, such as the United States. And basically, this is another way of saying that using hostile double standards toward Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. Scapegoating Israel in this way is not defending the legitimate rights of Palestinian Arab Muslims. It is a form of anti-Semitism. It supports genocide against Israel's Jews, and it supports Hamas and the larger Islamic and left extremist movements around the world. So we should support Israel. Fair-minded people should support Israel because supporting Israel means supporting peaceful coexistence of peoples and ways of life around the world. And this includes potentially a future demilitarized Palestinian state that would coexist with Israel. So to conclude, before we take questions, what should we all do in order to defend Israel and compare Israel to its enemies and show that Israel is much better than its enemies and much more worthy of support than its enemies? The most important thing is simply not to be intimidated by these extremists and their hate fantasies. They try to scream these accusations to the point where no other point of view can be heard, and any other point of view is considered unacceptable, even to be discussed. So to do this, we need to educate ourselves and others, and we need to do this as part of organizations in order to be effective. And there are so many excellent organizations that are doing this, including all of the organizations that are sponsoring this talk and the other talks that Michael talked about earlier. And we can all do this in our own ways. We can all join these organizations. We can support them by volunteering. We can support them by donating money. We can do it in the way that is most appropriate to our own personalities, doing something ourselves, helping others do something, seeking community and trying to make a difference. And if we all do this as much as possible, it will make a big difference. It will continue to make a big difference. And this is absolutely vital. I think that the most fundamental threat to Israel, apart from Iranian nuclear weapons, is this information war against Israel, above all in the United States. So let me stop there, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions.
So thank you, Shale, for the incredible presentation. You present the information in such a thorough, thoughtful, and compelling manner. There's so much there. So I want to ask everyone, if you have any questions, comments, share them in the chat, raise your virtual hand emoji and I can call on you, or since I say we're all family here, you can unmute yourself to speak while everyone is processing the information, because it is a lot. So while you think about some of the questions and comments, and we do have some in the chat already, but I want to start us off, Shale. So your areas of scholarship, expertise, and interest are in international and ethnic conflict and ethno-territorial wars, etc. And it lends so well to the topic of Israel and its enemies and the region. So when did you begin your focus of your scholarship or attention on Israel and anti-Semitism?
So in general, I was studying this type of conflict, which I'm calling your ethno-territorial conflict. That means where two peoples claim the same territory as their homeland. And those those peoples could have their own states or not. The conflict occurs in various forms. So, I've always studied Israel, followed Israel my whole life, but I came to it from this general comparative point of view. And in looking at dozens of conflicts like this around the world since World War II, there are over 50 major conflicts of this kind. I came to realize that across all of these conflicts, Israel is the most moderate in its goals and methods, and Israel's enemies are among the most extreme in their goals and methods. Despite the fact that Israel is so moderate, despite the fact that it faces far greater threats than any other state involved in a conflict like this. So the contrast between this conflict and the other conflicts is really breathtaking. And to go back to the point I made at the beginning, what Israel's enemies want to do is they want to look at a glass that's nearly full and say it's not full, and it's demonic that it's not full. And the different perspective that I see is that the glass is nearly full for Israel. It's as full as it is for any other state. And Israel's enemies, the glass is nearly empty.
And yet, with such a stark difference, the community in the Western countries or all over the world are somehow believing that Israel is the aggressor and Israel is the oppressor. So it seems like even though we have all of these facts on our side, that's not helping our cause.
When you are faced with radical enemies, you will get an Orwellian-style propaganda war. In other words, it makes no difference what the facts are. You will be portrayed as an absolute evil, and the other side will be portrayed as harmless or a kind of absolute good. And everything will be twisted to fit that narrative, and it will just be broadcast from the rooftops. So it's difficult to fight this sort of thing, but again, I would say the crucial thing is don't just play defense. Don't just say, no, I'm not a murderer. But not only am I not a murderer, but I'm among the best of all those that have been stuck in similar situations. And you, our enemies, are among the worst, and you are a threat to everyone else. And everyone else is next after they're through with Israel.
I'm wondering how all of this manifests on your campus and how you've been experiencing that. So are you able to talk a little bit about your own experiences on campus?
Sure, I am. As a matter of fact, in anticipation of this question, I'm going to share again. I have a couple slides. Okay, so all right, let me talk a little bit about my university. I just have 2 slides here. I'll try to get through this quickly, but it's kind of amazing. Okay, so my university is University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The leadership of our university has engaged in an appalling collusion with our anti-Israel student groups. I'm going to give you only some highlights here. Okay, so our chancellor allowed an illegal anti-Israel encampment for 2 weeks on campus. He ended the encampment with an agreement which officially adopted, this is by a public university, the rhetoric and methods of the anti-Israel student group. So he repeated, for example, the claim that Israel had committed genocide in the war with Hamas in Gaza, and he endorsed their efforts to boycott Israel by getting some water organization in Milwaukee to end its ties with Israeli companies, even though there's an anti-boycott law actually in Wisconsin. So it's not even legal to do that, but he did that anyway. So in other words, he accepted the claim that Israel was a demonic evil, right? Was committing genocide, and that methods like boycotts, which are aimed at destroying Israel, are to be supported. That's basically the official position that he took. The anti-Israel groups, in a number of important incidents, harassed and intimidated Jewish students and groups. He claimed that this harassment and intimidation was protected by free speech. and he refused to enforce the non-academic code of conduct. So just to explain what that is to people, the non-academic code of conduct is to cover things like shouting down speakers or menacing students on campus. So for example, those kinds of behavior might be considered protected by free speech on the street, let's say, if you have dueling demonstrations. But in a university setting, there's a protocol associated with education. All sides have to be heard respectfully, and all sides' points of view and their rights as students, faculty, and so on have to be tolerated in an equal way. So that's what the non-academic code of conduct exists to do. So for example, on April 17th, there was an Israel cultural event where the anti-Israel groups were allowed to set up a demonstration right near the Jewish groups. And then they crowded around them, came right up to them and started screaming at them from the river to the sea, Intifada. And the Jewish groups felt a need to flee for their safety off of campus. Then on July 19th, these groups in their official Instagram, you can see it there up on the right, they posted that they will not accept any organizations that support Israel's existence on campus. And they threatened these organizations by name, that they will not accept them. And the most dangerous threatening language you can see there in the red at the bottom, any organization that has not separated themselves from Israel will be treated as extremist criminals. So the university did finally condemn this Instagram post, but then they didn't do anything. After investigating it and temporarily suspending only the groups, they claimed that this was free speech and they didn't do anything about it. So what's obvious here is the double standard, right? I mean, would the university have done all these things if any other minority group were being targeted in these ways? So let me just say briefly some of the things that I and other people trying to fight back have been doing, are trying to do. This is ongoing. So number one, try to defend and counterattack in the local mass media. It's very unfortunate that unfortunately only the right-leaning websites for the most part and talk radio were willing to hear our point of view. Most of the left-leaning media outlets portrayed the anti-Israel groups as if they were grassroots humanitarians rather than parts of these global radical movements, which in the United States at the time, of course, were replicating these kinds of this kind of disruption and harassment and intimidation across American universities. And they typically refuse to even discuss the other point of view. And the most flagrant example of this is our local newspaper of record, which is called the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. It's sort of like the New York Times of Milwaukee. And they did this over and over again in their media coverage. So this is really very important because if it were not for this support from most left-leaning media outlets, these types of campaigns by anti-Israel groups would backfire in the public relations sphere. But instead, all that happens is their claims are repeated by much of the left-leaning media without being rebutted in any way, without another point of view being heard. So regardless of where we are, whether we're on the right or on the left, there has to be agreement about this, that we need to do everything we can to try to get these viewpoints out in all types of media outlets. And the most work needs to be done in the left-leaning ones. And of course, there are many moderate left-leaning media outlets that are willing to air a pro-Israel point of view. And it's very important to work in that area in particular. There was still the second bullet point there, the big one, there was still a big enough backlash against the chancellor's behavior that he was forced by the regents to resign early. He's still the chancellor now, but he's going to be resigning at the end of the academic year. Another thing that we are trying to do is to advance some legislative responses that will prevent similar types of things happening in the future. One is to get the IHRA definition that we talked about before of anti-Semitism accepted under Wisconsin law. It's currently accepted by 36 of the 50 states. Another important thing is to have direct political accountability for public universities. Let me explain what that is. So currently, there's a weird system where the Board of Regents, which governs the university, is appointed, its members are appointed for a fixed term by the governor. And then once they're appointed, they're an independent oversight actor over the university. So the problem that that creates is when the universities are misgoverned, when the chancellor or other university leaders fails to uphold equal standards or the mission of the university in the way that happened here, there is no political address. People complain, the governor or other political leaders can say, well, we don't really like this either, but it's not our call. And the problem is that these independent boards, like the Board of Regents in Wisconsin, they typically answer more to the insiders at the university than they do to the political representatives or the people. So the solution to this is that the university should be governed as an executive branch agency directly under the authority of the governor, just like any other executive branch agency. And the reason this would be beneficial is it would create a political address. In other words, as soon as something bad happens at the university, the governor becomes politically responsible. And then the governor would have to accept the political fallout if he or she did not do something about it. So I think that is a very important change. And although I don't think that's possible in Wisconsin politically as early as accepting the IHRA definition is, I think it is possible in the long run because I think there's a broader desire for this kind of political accountability that the current system where the inmates run the asylum at public universities is not acceptable. And then finally, the last point I would mention there is just that we can't be intimidated into silence on the campus. That means into not defending Israel. And it's very difficult for the students to do this by themselves because they're younger, they don't have as much experience, they don't have the confidence of older, more established people. And that means that the faculty and the local Jewish organizations have to stand up and support the students. And this has to be done in such a way that it will create a permanent presence at all major universities. It has to be coordinated and its effectiveness has to be refined over time. And it has to be something which is always there that students can go to and which is always there to hold the university administration accountable. So those are some of the things that I and others are trying to do here at UWM.
Amazing. Thank you. Again, thorough answer. That was awesome. I'm just going to do a plug that students supporting Israel, we have one of our students here, Michelle, Alums for Campus Fairness, Sandy is here, and from CAFI, which is the CUNY Alliance for Inclusion, we have the wonderful Eleanor. So our faculty is here from CUNY. We have students supporting Israel at Hunter College who's here, and we're trying to wrap ourselves around this together, faculty, students, and alumni, because even though we know that there are faculty who are the problem in some respects, we have faculty who unfortunately have it just as bad as students or worse, because students, they're in and out of the doors in 2 to 4 years. Faculty, they are in this for life. It's their job, it's their living. So we need to support them and we need to be together with them in this. So thank you, Shale. With that, I also have Simon who has a question. His hand is raised, the wonderful Simon. And then after Simon, I'm going to call on Rosa.
I do have a question, but let me just give a PS to Shale's wonderful summary. There's a lot going on in Milwaukee. Another aspect that's disturbing, Shale knows about this, was that it spilled over into the community. There was a report, not a report, there was incidents of murals going up in the community on storefronts showing Star of David with a swastika, and it got vandalized and so forth there. And also to Shale's point about the strange structure, political structure of Wisconsin and the inability to manage this. The president of the university criticized our chancellor, but was powerless to do anything about it. And it was quite public and embarrassing for all of us. Another incident that is going to lead to my question, Shale, was that there was an attempt, which is a traditional liberal strategy of if we can only talk it out, then fair-minded heads will prevail. And this is getting to your point about disinformation. And I attended that event. It was a travesty. I don't know if you did. It ended up, there were members of the Jewish Federation that were invited there to speak about Israel and representatives of the Palestinians. But what I came away from that clearly, and I've heard talk shows also talk about this, was the end of dialogue, that there is an intentional strategy not to engage in debate or even fact finding. And this seems to be a turn in the usual kind of civil discourse that we're used to. And so it has a broad implication, but also a specific one to the response that supporters of Israel and trying to understand the situation, and also with our students and faculty who clearly are being turned away from this by these actions. So my question is whether you see this as a turn and whether anything can be done about this academically and politically.
Yeah, thank you for that question and for the background information, Simon. So there's no question that it's an intentional
And the
strategy.
event was organized by DEI. We do have a, which also was criticized because they didn't pay much attention to the Jewish students with our office, but this was what they proposed to try to keep the peace, but it ended up making things worse. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so it is definitely an intentional strategy not to allow a structured discussion, because that discussion will show what I was just trying to argue, right? It will show that the supposed values of people claiming to take positions on these issues are consistent with what Israel has been trying to do in the conflict, rather than what Israel's enemies have been trying to do in the conflict. Of course, there are some former enemies of Israel or many people in the Arab and Islamic worlds that are not enemies of Israel, obviously, but we're speaking about the main forces that are fighting Israel. So they don't want that dialogue. And, I think that this is comparable, this is analogous to the strategies of other ideologically radical movements, right? Like if we look at fascists or communists, let's say, they don't want academic discussions. They want to shut down all discussions and all other points of view, and just impose their point of view, because that's the way in which they're most likely to prevail. In other words, they want to create a situation where there are only two choices, them or whatever survives their onslaught. And then that gives them a greater ability to win and to seize power. In this case, in the case of the event that you're talking about, I was actually one of the people on the panel. And there were a whole set of rules laid out in advance about not disrupting the meeting. The university was not prepared at all to do anything about violations of those rules. When the rules were violated, it did not do anything to punish people. That would be upholding the non-academic code of conduct. That's what it's supposed to do, especially if you make a big point of claiming that these rules are in force. So they, like you said, they themselves were not prepared to take this seriously in any way. And I can't get into the heads of the people that planned it, but they certainly played into the hands of those that intended to shut it down and not allow any discussion.
Yeah, and I see this elsewhere too, in other universities that often do try to create a panel or so forth. Sorry, I didn't recognize you, but yes, you were a good voice there, and a lot of faculty also, I think, are responsible not for fact finding, but for jumping to quote unquote the defense of students when in fact this actually came up at a Dean's Council meeting where the provost said, I don't understand the outrage by the Jewish organizations, because there's been no violence, totally discounting the psychological and emotional damage that occurred to them. And just for the record, both of us are on the Jewish Studies Advisory panel, and we put out a statement which was censored by marketing and communications with the idea that no departments were to make a statement about the situation.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, for adding that context in your question. I love that you're both at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, so I think it's very helpful to have you share your experiences as well.
Yeah, the most active voice has been the Jewish Federation of Greater Milwaukee. It has been vocal as we've been silenced, I'm afraid, on the campus.
I think it's something what you're experiencing is exactly what we have on all college campuses right now, or most. And it's a big part of the problem. It's feeding the problem. Rosa, you had a question, so I'm going to give you the floor.
First of all, thank you for explaining this so clearly, because in turn we can explain it clearly too. And secondly, my question was, would you say that this portrayal of Palestinians or Gazans as the underdog, the victim, the way they're seen as if they can do no wrong is part of the problem? And if yes, how do we counteract it? How do we best counteract it? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, of course, that's a very important point from a public relations point of view, Rosa. So I think there are a couple of points to be made about this. The first point is, does anyone really believe that the weaker side is always more virtuous than the stronger side? I mean, that just does not follow logically. Okay, so, criminals are weaker than police. Does that make criminals better than police? Or, you can give many other examples of this. Now, another important response to this is that the picture of Israel as the Goliath and the Palestinians as the David, this is a result of what you could call cropping or framing the conflict. So this conflict used to be called the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it's clear that the Palestinian Arab identity is Arab and Muslim, and it is embedded within this larger Arab and Muslim identity. And the conflict with Israel could never take the form that it has taken if it were with just the Palestinians in a vacuum. Such a conflict would never exist. So the Palestinians are, just as the Palestinians are a regional Arab identity, the Palestinians are the nearest of Israel's enemies, those Palestinians that are Israel's enemies, Hamas, the PLO. So what we always need to do is zoom back, right? And say, it's not Israel fighting the Palestinians, it's Israel fighting Hamas, the PLO, and all of their state sponsors, and the broader radical movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, the whole Iranian Axis, and all of their supporters. And furthermore, the countries that Israel is nominally at peace with, like Jordan and Egypt, does anyone doubt that if Israel looked to be teetering, that they would join the fight to destroy it? There's no question about that. So Israel is in a fight with a huge, powerful, hydra-headed entity, of which the Palestinians are only one small part. And I think that's the point to come back to. So in that accurate sense, Israel is the David and Israel's enemies are the Goliath.
Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. There's another question that sort of relates to Holocaust education. So I'm going to ask that. Aaron, who's a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, writes, Jews insist Holocaust education is needed, and he says that he feels that will lead to inversion arguments without Israel and Middle East 101 instruction. So he's asking in that case, what will bridge the divide? Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Um, I think that the inversion arguments are already there and are inevitable. So I think Holocaust education doesn't increase inversion arguments. So I think the answer is to preserve Holocaust education and to talk about the fact that, the primary purpose of Israel, apart from just self-determination for the Jewish people, is to prevent another Holocaust. And that it's Israel's enemies that want to perpetrate another Holocaust. Israel doesn't and has never threatened anything of that kind. So there's no avoiding going back and talking about the conflict itself. And perhaps the best way of doing that is to not limit Holocaust education only to the Holocaust. In other words, you shouldn't avoid the issue of the fact that this comparison is going to be made. You, as a Holocaust educator, I mean, obviously nothing is like the Holocaust, but I mean, we just saw on October 7th what would happen if Israel was defeated militarily. We would see that on a much larger scale, and then whoever survived would be expelled. So that would be another Holocaust. So I don't think there's any avoiding that. I mean, Israel compares very well to Britain and the United States during World War II. Much more moderate in the goal and the means it's willing to use to defend its survival, even though it's far more threatened than Britain or the United States were.
Let me call on Deborah and then Matt. Both have their hand raises.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is, I keep coming across this by non-Jews and Jews. They'll say, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. And then you go through the IHRA definition, but how do you explain that to somebody who's already inclined to, who's already drank the Kool-Aid and is not inclined to see things the way fair-minded people do because they've been brainwashed? What's the best way to approach that? What's the best way to answer that?
I think the best way is simply to state what kind of a double standard that is. In other words, so your position is that Jews do not have a right to self-determination, but that 22 Arab states have a right to self-determination, even though Jews as a people precede the Arab Muslim identity in the region by some 2,000 years. So by what right do 22 states descended from one of the greatest world imperialism have a right to self-determination, but this small people does not?
And yes, and if they come back and say, but why don't the Palestinian, they don't see it as, I also see it as Israel is the David and the Muslim world of 2 billion people, mostly enemies, is the Goliath. The friends are the exception.
Yes.
It's a sea of enemies,
Yes.
not Canada and Mexico, not even Russia, like mortal enemies. But they'll come back and say, don't the Palestinians have a right to self-determination? They're different. They're Palestinian. There's a Palestinian national identity, even though I know that genetically they're genetically akin to the people in Jordan and from the Gulf, and many of the Arabs that lived in Israel pre-1948 have Gulf Arab DNA.
Sure.
An Egyptian and all kinds of, there is no Palestinian ethnicity. So,
Sure.
but how do you say that to somebody who is coming from a different point of view, from this DEI point of view, from this, which you were
the
talking.
first thing to say, the first thing to say, Deborah, is believing or accepting a Palestinian right to self-determination is not the same thing as anti-Zionism, right?
Right.
In other words, you can support Jews' right to self-determination and Palestinians' rights to self-determination.
Yes.
And Israel has always accepted that in a variety of forms. I mean, over and over again in various forms, and would be open to it at any time, right?
Yes.
Even particular governments who might not be willing to make the same concessions as other governments, if the Israeli population perceived, a genuine will to live side by side, two states for two peoples, whether you support that or not, there's little question that they would make an agreement like that. So Israel has not contested that by and large over time. Particular governments have at certain points in time, but Israel has almost always accepted this principle of Palestinian self-determination in some form, while its enemies have not accepted a Jewish self-determination.
And then you'll hear them saying, there's apartheid, it's a colonial state, all that. Whereas when you come back and say, how many Jews live in Ramallah? How many Jews live in Gaza? They don't get it. So
yeah, I mean, again,
they also don't get that there's 20% of the population of Israel are Muslim, so they don't get that either. So they're looking at like the West, like Judea and Samaria. But there's a reason why there are checkpoints, and there's a reason why there's a wall. But it's really hard to get to people that have, somebody said, drank the Kool-Aid, that have accepted this DEI definition, oppressor, oppressed, Israelis are white oppressors, all that stuff. It's very hard to get through to them. They see things a certain way. It's kind of, it's this groupthink, and even intelligent people are not fair-minded, are not open-minded, are not interested in the facts. Actually, it's an emotional issue for them. It's not based on facts, because if they did examine the facts, they could not hold their positions.
Yeah. So, listen, in other words, you can't convince everyone. There's no question about that. Okay. So the people that have totally taken the position that Israel is demonic, that won't listen to any discussion, they have to be branded as part of the problem. They have to be branded as anti-Semites. They have to be branded as people that support the genocide of Jews in Israel. They have to be branded as supporters of the most ideologically extreme movements in the world that are preying on people all over the world. And let them live with that label and let them have that thrown back in their face. And then many people can be convinced if the facts are explained to them and if these kinds of comparisons are made. So, each segment of the audience or opposition has to be met with tactics which are appropriate to where they are.
I think that's a beautiful answer, Deborah. Thank you so much for asking that, pushing a little bit more. And Shale, thank you for answering that. I really do believe just the 2 points from Shale is we're not going to change everyone's mind. We're not going to reach everybody. But also, Deborah, everything you mentioned is us being on the defense. And what I'm gathering from Shale is we have to turn that on them and ask the question. I think that's one of the most beautiful things in dialogue and discussion, where we don't have to always be on the defense. We can be on the offense. We can ask them questions. And sometimes I think that's what leads to, as Simon was saying and someone else mentioned, wanting to shut down these conversations, because once you get to some actual dialogue, it points to all the holes in their arguments. But I think we still need to push that. So I do apologize for interjecting as well, but just to share that Shale's point, that we need to ask those questions and point out their side and what's wrong with that. That is so meaningful in that conversation.
And immediately we have to do that, right? In other words, the answer, the defensive answer has to go right over into the counterattack and accuse them of what they are doing wrong. And they have to be put on the defensive immediately because they are the extremists. They are the ones that won't compromise.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful, thank you. So then we'll go to Matt has a question. I see Eleanor, but first I want to go to Matt, then Aaron, and then Eleanor, if that's okay with all of you. Thank you. And Shale, thank you so much for sticking with us.
So Shale, first of all, thank you very much. Is there any way to get this presentation? Because I think that the logical way you present, if you like fact rather than alternative fact, is really good as a way of kind of helping others understand it. But so my question goes to how do we change the narrative? I think that's what you've been saying. One, from a media perspective, how do you do it? Clearly, whatever we've been doing from a media perspective is just not working. Secondly, how do we use what happened in Syria last night to change the narrative? So here we have one of Israel's worst enemies, a major supporter of Hezbollah and Hamas, suddenly falls, and it so happens, well, wait a second, they're actually a pretty demonic organization there. how do we use this as a way to amplify that message of, wait a second, it's the enemies of Israel who really represent the wrong side, if you like?
Yeah. So your first question, this is largely above my pay grade. Okay. This is about how do you bypass the major media outlets which are more institutionally hostile to Israel? And the answer to that is largely social media and these kind of pop-up sources, websites, which can be very effective. And some of them have accumulated huge followings. So that's the way to go, I'm convinced. But I'm not somebody that is knowledgeable enough about that to give a detailed answer. With respect to what we're seeing in Syria, I think, again, a lot of this is about not being intimidated by the other side and throwing our own labels, which are more accurate, back in their face. Okay, so no, Israel is not fighting the Palestinians. Israel is fighting Hamas. Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood spawned Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Israel is fighting the same entities as those other countries in the world that are being targeted by Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or other Islamic extremists. So the same thing with the various far left groups that are attacking, like in my own campus, Students for Democratic Society. I mean, they believe in revolution, right? They want to, if you own a business, they want to kill you if you won't give it over to them and seize your wealth and enslave you. Okay, that's who these people are. We have to be able to say that. We have to be able to go right back at them. And look, in the case of Syria right now, again, we can't go on for very long about this, but these are devils fighting each other. This guy Al-Jalani, who's the head of HTS, he used to be affiliated at times with Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. HTS used to be the Nusra Front, which was the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. We shouldn't expect anything good from these various people fighting each other. The only question is, which is a greater threat to us, so we have to focus on potentially dealing with first, but it's not our fight by and large, and all we can do is, make people understand the situation, who these people are, and try to, respond in a careful, realistic way. But yeah, it's a tragic testimony to the dominance of these radical forces in the region that this is what the Arab Spring has led to, right? The Arab Spring has led to conflicts between various species of jihadists and vicious dictatorships of socialist nationalists like the Assads.
So we'll call on Aaron next. I got Eleanor after.
Yeah, I could ask you questions all night, and I appreciate your taking the time to do this. In the future, hopefully sooner than later, what kind of peaceful existence do you see possible with the neighbors to the south, northeast, west, and how, more importantly, like how do you see Gaza being de-radicalized? Because right now everyone is just taught to hate Israel, and I think that's a major issue. And I'll mute myself.
Okay. So very good questions, Aaron. I think my big answer to the first question is when you have been living through conflicts generationally, like Israelis have and Jews watching from the outside, it's very tempting to be sucked into unrealistic hopes that some kind of a lasting peace agreement can easily be reached. And some version of that, if it were tried, would finally, bring us to that Eden. But generally speaking, that is not realistic. In other words, Israel has to try to reach, some kind of stable coexistence. It might not necessarily be friendly with as many important actors as possible in the neighborhood. Each actor is a case-by-case basis. Sometimes more than one can be involved at a time. But all of these agreements are very fragile, given that we have not seen a fundamental transformation of values in the Arab and Islamic worlds yet, in most parts of the Arab and Islamic worlds. There are some areas like, there are countries like Albania or something like that, where they're very westernized and there's no ideology like there is in other parts of the Arab and Islamic worlds. But this is a long-term process, and any kinds of agreements you arrive at are very fragile. We saw when the Muslim Brotherhood briefly came to power in Egypt, how easily a peace agreement can go up in smoke. One of the consequences of what just happened in Syria could be, before very long, the fall of the Jordanian monarchy and its replacement by an Islamist regime. So these agreements are fragile, and Israel does not have the ability to control events in this gigantic region. All it can do is keep its powder dry and do the best it can in reaching arrangements with various important actors. So that is a process that has to go on forever, basically, effectively forever. People talk about our grandchildren. That's not going to be enough time to transform this region into Western Europe. So get used to it. It's another way of saying get used to more of the same that we've seen since 1948. In terms of Gaza, it's very difficult because there's a kind of catch-22. So Israel does not want to directly rule Gaza because that would be very messy. It would produce a lot of backlash even in Israel itself, because people would be very unhappy about it in the way that they were unhappy about it in the past. So then therefore Israel needs some kind of local partner, like in its imperfect way it has with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which obviously isn't leading to peace, with the Palestinian Authority, but nevertheless it's better than Hamas. But where is such an entity in Gaza? So if it starts to develop, Israel might cultivate it, but there is no easy end game here that will de-radicalize Gaza. And I think the only point I'm making differently from the point that you were making is I would focus not only on popular public opinion, but on organized political power. Who is capable of competing for political power and ruling? What are the different possible entities? And it's very difficult to see any viable partner for Israel in Gaza. If such a partner existed, the government would already have chosen it and would already have been working together with them. So again, I think we're in for more of the same in the future in Gaza. The only difference is going to be that I don't think any Israeli government is going to completely withdraw from Gaza in a way that allows Hamas or organizations like Hamas to rebuild the kind of power that Hamas had accumulated by 2023.
Incredible answer. Very thorough. Thank you, Shale. So we'll go to Eleanor next.
Thank you. So first of all, thanks to both of you for this program. Secondly, Michael, I sent you a link to a podcast by Yossi Klein Halevi, partly because it's interesting for you, but also for Shale, because Yossi's reflection is, look, we haven't been in power for over 2 millennia, and we're not used to it, and we're learning how to act non-defensively. So the whole part of your point is to understand, justify, figure out solutions for being hated. We Jews being hated, right, worldwide. Another approach is a little, perhaps, and certainly we need armed responses, so we all know that. But another approach that you didn't mention, I think, is legal action. We have the same structure of our university that you have, except we call them a board of trustee instead of a so on, so on. Ours doesn't, our chancellor, the board of trustees gets appointed for various terms by mayor and governor. We have the IRA definition in New York, does zero good. So I think I at least am in the mood for a little bit more legal action, lawsuits and injunctions and so on, and focusing on which terrorist linked student, never mind faculty, organizations are on campus, and let's get them off. What about masking with CAFI or otherwise? Let's not allow it. So thinking of very get out of your chair kinds of approaches. That's where I'm headed right now in my own, never mind to Israel for a few weeks to volunteer, but that, you know, we've had a lot of dialogue, and that's what CUNY Alliance for Inclusion focuses on, but we've been having a lot of dialogue and we're not getting the results one would hope.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about the legal actions. That's also something that we're pursuing here on this end. As you know, that's limited by the various legal pathways that are available to you. Okay, so you know, one of those is Title VI through the Department of Education. Now, that one has been toothless so far because universities just agree to things which are performative and don't really make a difference. But it might not be under the right administration.
Correct.
Right.
They're already meeting. The day after Trump was elected, I know this is not a popular topic. The day after Trump was elected, there were Title VI and DEI meetings throughout the universities. You might think about that.
Yes, for sure, Eleanor. Okay, so that is one avenue. Then another avenue is, for example, state law, right? Like you can pass a law against masks, let's say, in a demonstration, if you can get the votes, that's good. Now, another thing that you know that we're really pushing here is, you know, we have a non-academic code of conduct for a reason. If students disrupt or harass or intimidate, they should be suspended and expelled from the university. And the chancellor has to enforce that.
Yes.
So the chancellor isn't going to do that without political pressure from the bosses, the governor, the legislature. So that's where this accountability thing comes in, right? And again, the best you can hope for there, if you establish that accountability, is that often you are going to get good governors and good legislatures that are going to enforce this on the university, you know, through firing people or threatening to fire people, or through withholding their budgets or threatening to withhold their budgets. So that, you know, that is another avenue. So, you know, you're totally right in all of the above. And then, but another thing which is really important, I come back to the last point that I made in the slides about UWM, that is, we have to maintain a visible pro-Israel presence at all times on all major campuses. And we cannot yield the battlefield to these people that want to destroy us.
Amen.
Thank you.
Let me close with an optimistic note, okay? Which is, despite all the problems that we're talking about, Israel is a glorious success. No one could ever have imagined in 1948 that today, some 75 years earlier, Israel would have the population and the economic and military power of a country like Sweden, and would be more advanced technologically, and would be far healthier demographically and culturally. I mean, Israel is an unbelievable success, and we should take tremendous pride in it and its ability to achieve this in a humane way and in a moderate way. and the fact that it will continue to do that despite all of its troubles. And we all need to appreciate that and continue to play our role in continuing this glorious success. And all of us here in the United States have a very important role to play for the reason that I said, which is that the information war, particularly in the United States, is the second most important front in the war against Israel. And it's a front where we can make a difference, and we will continue to make a difference.
Shale, thank you so much. You are an incredible speaker, presenter, author, writer. It just means so much, and you've spent 2 hours with us. Thank you so much for all of your time, expertise, and wisdom, and sharing that with us. Everyone, thank you so much for being here. And remember that we have an event or program on Zoom on Wednesday, December 11th, Sunday, December 15th, and Monday, December 16th. All as amazing as this program, and I hope to see you at each and every one of them. Thank you all so much for being here. Shale, again, thank you so much for everything. Take care, everyone. Be well.
Thanks to everybody.